this. Well, I think it is still good morning in some parts of the world, and good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to the latest session in today's launch summit for Aftershocks and Opportunities. So if this wasn't what you were expecting to be at, now's a good time to leave. We have three excellent contributors to the book joining us to share some of the ideas in their chapter. We have Joe Tankersley, Morgan Kauffman, Lee Schupp, and each of them will talk for about 9 or 10 minutes. We'll then do a couple of polling questions, and then we'll do Q&A with the participants. See a goodly number of participants out there, so I'm sure we'll get a lot of interesting questions. There's some brilliant content to be shared. Joe, lead us off, please. Tell us who you are, and then tell us a bit about your chapter.
Well, thanks a lot, Rohit, and thanks for putting this whole experience together and having the endurance to take us through a whole day of looking at the future after the pandemic. My name is Joe Tankersley. I am a futurist and a writer of speculative fiction. I came to the world of futures somewhat backwards. I started out as a storyteller many years ago, spent 20 years at the Walt Disney Company, imagining theme parks and the future at Epcot. Over that time period, realized that stories were one of the most powerful tools that we have for really understanding and preparing our future. So my piece for the book, I actually decided to focus on a potential aftershock of the pandemic, which I have to say is rare for me because I am normally the optimist in the crowd. But one of the things that has really struck me about this particular moment in time is from the very beginning, I saw an awful lot of stuff being written that to me felt overly optimistic about what was going to happen after this particular pandemic was over and we figured out a way to deal with COVID-19 on an ongoing basis. And so I thought it was time that we probably needed to be a little bit more cynical in the way we think about the future. And I have to say before I talk about the specifics is that I'm not discounting all of the positive and optimistic scenarios out there. They're always critical, they're always important. Generally, I agree with Bob Johansson in that our real goal is to help people be first to tomorrow. And I think you do that by looking for opportunities. But I think it's a bad idea to completely ignore the possibility of challenges. And in this particular instance, I think we need to do that. So how does that all relate back to foresight and what can we do by trying to anticipate aftershocks? And my idea is that if we can understand the potential better, then we have some possibilities of creating strategies to avoid them. So I'm not trying to predict the future, and I'm sure everyone else today has said the same thing. But what we're trying to do is understand that there will be a whole host of possible ramifications, and they'll be very localized in many instances. Much of what I'm thinking about in terms of the aftershocks are, of course, localized in the United States, where I am, and we've got some differences here in terms of a fragile system that I think will see more damage than some other places that are actually trying to deal with it. But what I want to try to get people to understand is the impact of any disruption. And what we really want to try and do is not just explore the moment, and the moment right now, of course, is incredibly chaotic, and we're trying to figure out what the best strategy is to go forward, but to begin to understand how the ripples from this disruption might actually take place. And if you think about it, if you throw a pebble into a pond of water, you create a bunch of ripples. Each of those ripples tends to get larger and larger. And in some circumstances, they might get so big that they can have incredibly destructive impacts very far away from the very moment where you actually created the original disruption. And that's really what a futurist job is all about, is looking at those second, third, fourth, fifth, and all the way up to 10th and 20th second orders of impacts from all of these things. So just to sort of context that into something I think we've all been talking about. Right now, everybody is talking a lot, and we've been talking about it just a few minutes ago, about how the pandemic is accelerating this trend toward remote work. So we all know that's one of the first order impacts. The second order impact immediately is that we know there are less cars on the road. We know that if this continues after the pandemic, if we work at home more, and of course we don't know for sure yet, but if that happens, then we'll start to change the nature of the commercial real estate demand in cities across the nation. And that's a third order effect. A fourth order effect would be the possibility that we might see new and innovative ways to think about how we use commercial real estate in cities. So you begin to see how they build one on the other. And that is just a little example that I think hopefully everybody understands. So I want to finally focus for just a couple of minutes on the specifics of my story, which is titled When the Future Was Bright. And I'm really looking at the potential aftershocks on the US healthcare system caused by the pandemic. There's an initial observation that I think you have to take into account. And that is that when healthcare officials started talking about the need to stay in place and to lock down and to close businesses, they did it for three reasons. The first reason was to decrease the overall number of victims. We didn't want people to be exposed. The second was to develop tracking and treatment plans so that we would know how to deal with people once we began to reopen after that. And the third one was to overload a vulnerable system. The US healthcare system, despite all of its greatness, is actually very fragile because it's designed to be incredibly efficient. It's not designed to deal with a major disruption. And as we 2 months later started to think about reopening and focusing totally on the economic impacts of the pandemic, we have forgotten that third piece. We have forgotten the fact that we are overloading a vulnerable system. And so the question is, what are the potential disruptions of that? And here's the scenario that I think might play out. Is if we assume for a moment that this pandemic may last for 18 months, even 2 years before we begin to understand how to better deal with it and cope with it overall, by then we will have a healthcare system, in this country at least, that has been pushed past its limits. They're going to be complete exhaustion, not in terms of just human power and human resources, but also in terms of the economic resources that are devoted to the healthcare system. And you know, the interesting thing about that is that economic impact is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, ICUs are being overloaded because of the pandemic. On the other hand, we're putting off all of this other healthcare, which means that general practitioners and people like that are finding themselves damaged economically. So 2 years from now, we're going to have a system that's going to be very, very fragile. What are some of the second order impacts? The first one is going to be potentially a massive reduction in workforce. People are going to be burned out. Most of our nursing capacity in this country is 50 years and older, so they're already near retirement. So you're likely going to see a huge number of people just simply opting out of the system. That may be followed by massive layoffs if the economics are not there and the system's been damaged. That will be complicated by the fact that in this country, particularly at the federal level and even at the state and local level, governments probably will not have the resources to continue to rebuild that healthcare system. The third order impact is the one that starts to get interesting to me. And that is that once that happens, the obvious outcome is we'll have a significant reduction in services being offered. And that's going to come at a time when around the globe, but particularly in the United States, we've got a huge stress on the system because we have so many more older patients who need much, much more care. And this is where the speculative part of my chapter comes in. I begin to wonder what happens. How do we deal with that? And one way, and the way that I hope we don't, but it's certainly a possibility, is the imposition of draconian measures. We begin to ration medical care. And who are we most likely to deny that care to? The aged, ill, infirm patients, the ones who cost the most to the system and actually deliver the least in terms of return. So that's what the story is about in When the Future Was Bright. And I'll let you go and find out how that actually resolves itself in that particular moment. But I want to just conclude with this. This is not about predicting the future. That's not what futures do. It's offering a wide range of possibilities for us to think about, because the more open we are to the more different possibilities out there, then the better chance we have to create strategies to create that future that we actually want to create. So I would urge all of you to think about what happens when you toss the pebble in your pond, whether it's in commercial real estate, whether it's in the healthcare industry, whatever industry you're in, and to begin to follow those ripples so that you can plan accordingly. That's sort of my summary, Rohit. I hope it gives people some idea as to one approach to thinking about the post-pandemic future.
Thank you, Joe, and a lovely, tantalizing hook to how that story plays out, and it really is well worth a read. Our next speaker is Morgan Dee Councilman, another futurist, graduate of the Houston Futures Program, much like Lee and several of the other contributors to this book, actually. And his chapter really builds on that theme of how do we deal with the pandemic? How might we deal with it? And his chapter is called This Is a Drill, Preparing for the Next Pandemic. Over to you, Morgan. Let me give you the screen.
There we go. Thank you, Rohit. Um, so I come at futures from the perspective of systems and public policy these days. Spent the last 8 years working on a book on the subject, so it's kind of my default. Um, and the thought that grabbed me when I was asked to contribute to this project was what kind of policy gets put in place after a disaster like this is hit, after we've gotten out of the worst of it and are trying to put the pieces back together. And the answer is fairly obvious to any historian. Policymakers try to make it so that the next disaster is impossible, or at least to reassure their voters that they're doing something to prevent it from happening again. And whether it's security measures after a terrorist attack or banking regulation after a financial collapse, they always try to do something. Whether it works or not is another question, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. What does that look like, though, for a pandemic? Because you can't stop a virus just by having security guards. You have to have medical personnel on staff and able to develop tests. You have to develop a vaccine in order to stop it permanently. But in the meantime, you have to have some sort of social distancing, whether it be a complete shutdown or the more limited test and trace based shutdowns that we've seen in Singapore and Taiwan and such. It still has a massive disruptive effect on the economy and on people in general. It's become almost traumatic. Not almost, it has been traumatic to a lot of folks who have been stuck in their houses for a prolonged period of time. And so if it's impossible to stop a disruption and it's impossible to avoid it, what do you have to do? You have to prepare for it. What does that look like from a citizen's point of view? And more practically from my perspective, how do I cram all of that perspective into a single 1,000-word chapter? And so I went with the tried and true what if scenario. What if we have a month-long quarantine drill every 2 years? What does that do to deal with and prepare us for a next pandemic? And I would argue that it's actually a fairly, at least in the thought experiment, fairly respectable way to make us more resilient to such a massive disruption. If people know that they are going to have to be isolated for a month out of every 2 years, then they build that expectation into their work lives, into their family lives, into their purchasing habits. If people know what's involved in being isolated for a month at a time or longer, there's less panic and disruption when they are suddenly plunged into one unexpectedly by an actual pandemic. If you know what's involved and what you need to survive a month in your house, then there isn't a mass panic buy of toilet paper, among other things. If the means to work and to educate and to survive are already in place to deal with a single month, then companies, communities, families are able to deal with it if an actual real pandemic strikes. And so it's not just at the corporate or family or personal level either, it's also at the governmental level, because the adaptations needed to make such a thing actually work, rather than being a terrible idea or just a pipe dream, are also ones that would be instantly adaptable to a real pandemic. If we have a universal basic income or a governmental protection for subsidizing employers to ensure that they pay their workers, even though their workers aren't actually doing any work, then that can be applied rather than panicking and implementing something ad hoc when the pandemic strikes. The things that are in place for the drill can be put in place for a real pandemic. Ditto, if we have prepackaged pallets of this is what you need to last a month, and suppliers all just put this together into a single package for a single person to last 2 weeks, a month, whatever, then that stuff's already in the supply chain. You can just say, accelerate the production of these and get them to people ahead of time so that we can have them ready when everybody's in isolation for the real thing, rather than just for the drill. And if people already have it in expectation of the drill, then hey, they don't need to go out and buy everything. And ditto for the subsidies for low-income folks who can't afford that kind of massive buyout. if those subsidies are already in place for the drill, then those subsidies can be extended for the real thing. And it's not just a pandemic. These things are also usable in other scenarios. Disaster like a hurricane that knocks out power for a week. Well, hey, people already have that pallet of goods that they need to survive the drill. They can use the same stuff for the hurricane. So forth and so on. And it's just, it builds in a huge amount of resilience to society. And also the fact that if we have the measures used to help with making sure that people can actually go through the drill who are disadvantaged and unprivileged in society, they can also be used to expand on that and make it so that they can make it better through the year. Once you've got the adaptations needed to house the homeless to make it through the isolation drill, you can house them for not just a month. It becomes a lot easier to expand that to an entire year. Once you've overcome the technical and bureaucratic barriers to basic income for a single month, it becomes a lot more feasible to expand that to a full year and make it a truly universal basic income. And so forth and so on. It's not just the adaptations necessary to make the drill work, it also becomes the foundation for resiliency in many other forms of life. The point isn't really that this particular policy platform should be adopted, although do we think that it would work if it was done properly and in good faith. The point is that, with a whole bunch of futurists here, I'm definitely preaching to the choir, but if we can build resilience into the society before the next disaster strikes, we'd all be better off for it. Don't think I quite used up all my time, but
yeah,
that's pretty much all I got.
We'll use it in the Q&A. Thank you. And it was a brilliant chapter. It really stood out because it was that, using such imagination around, well, how would you prevent this again? And it really, it stood out for that reason. All the chapters in the book stood out for different reasons, but yours stood out for this idea of, wow, yeah, you could do that. And actually, as bizarre as it sounds, it would be better to do that once every period, so often, so that we didn't have the kind of panic we've seen this time round. And really, everyone just knows what to do and kicks into that dance routine for that month.
Ask anyone who lives in an earthquake zone, compared to someone like me in Texas who has never experienced an earthquake. Like, we just saw a great example with the New Zealand Prime Minister just shrugging it off when an earthquake hit her press conference. If you know what to do and you know to look above you to ensure that nothing's going to fall on you, the panic is significantly less. Just preparation.
Excellent. Okay, so we're now going to take the third presentation in this session, and this is from Leland Schupp. And I guess we've got three different views of America here. Joe's picture of what happens if we call it too early. Morgan's picture of how do we prevent this happening again or prepare for it, and then Lee's really saying, how does the pandemic come together with everything else going on to map out some possible scenarios for the presidency? And so Lee's chapter, Which Way America, Four Alternative Futures, does just that for us, and I shall hand you the control.
Great, thanks, Rohit.
You're already, you're there. Excellent.
Great, well, thanks everybody. First, congratulations to Joe and Morgan for some really great chapters. I have also come out of the University of Houston Futures program. I live in California, so I do have an earthquake bag packed in all of my cars, which you would expect from a futurist, I suppose. I have been doing innovation consulting for about 20 years, coming out of the University of Houston program. And I've worked mostly with innovation consultancies and creating new products, brand, and service experiences by deeply understanding people, culture, and change. So for the scenarios that I worked on, in one moment, because there we go. Sorry about that. We're really coming on a pivotal election in America. So what I tried to do is look one election ahead of where we are now and see what kind of environment we might have going into the 2024 elections and the presidency of 2025. And I really looked at two different things. First, the shape of the economic recovery. you've probably heard these different letters used in terms of speaking of what the recovery could look like, but they're basically a V, which assumes a really fast downturn and a really fast recovery, a U, which assumes a quick downturn, more time at the bottom, and more gradual recovery, a W, which assumes that we recover in stops and starts, and an L, which assumes that we go down and don't come back out for a long time, sort of like the Great Recession of the 1930s. The other thing that seemed critical and uncertain to me was the outcome of the 2020 US election. Right now, it looks pretty much like a toss-up. Both parties have very different approaches to governing and could have a disproportionate impact on both the US and the world, depending on who gets elected. So the four scenarios are really built around the shape of the recovery and what the election looks like that's coming up this year. So the American Reich is built around a V-shaped recovery. So that assumes that the virus is controlled pretty quickly and we recover with the economy very quickly, and that Trump gets reelected. Renewal assumes a U-shaped recovery and a Democratic sweep of both the presidency and the Senate. Rough sledding assumes a W-shaped recovery that's much more jagged, that Biden gets elected, but that Republicans retain control of the Senate. And the Greatest Depression assumes an L-shaped recovery, which is a slow to no recovery, with Biden elected and Republicans remaining in control of the Senate. So these are really fun to write, and I hope you guys enjoy reading them, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens. The American Reich assumes a V-shaped recovery that Trump can claim credit for a quick economic recovery, and then he gets reelected. And most political pollsters don't think that this is an outrageous outcome. It's really looked at as being close right now. And Trump has a very strong social media machine in place. This assumes then that we really continue in the arc we've been in for the last 4 years. The Republicans pretty actively dismantling government, eroding institutions, and really not playing by the rules, really operating under the philosophy that the end justifies the means and whatever means necessary to retain control. And I couldn't help but get some inspiration from the man in the high castle for the graphic for this. Renewal assumes a U-shaped recovery, and because the recovery is much slower, the current administration is blamed more come election time. And this assumes a Democratic sweep of both the presidency and the Senate. And in the US, the Senate is very important in controlling governance because it has a lot of control over the judiciary and through federal appointments. And in this scenario, renewal really can happen within the US, where institutions start to be rebuilt, the civic functioning of government starts to be rebuilt, and US engagement in the world starts to happen again. And international cooperation slowly comes back, but the US has a greater participatory role, but does not get the leadership role it's had previously because it's been AWOL for 4 years. Rough sledding assumes a W-shaped recovery, so really recovering in stops and starts, and that Biden is elected, but that Republicans retain control of the Senate. This leads to a gridlocked government where progress is halting and slow. And we really see a lot of start and stop in the recovery, which just makes things really difficult. As sectors reopen, the virus comes back, sectors have to close down again. And we're in this sort of limbo that we will likely see in the middle of this year. Greatest Depression is the least optimistic scenario. It assumes that we have an L-shaped recovery, which is really no recovery at all or a very slow recovery. In this scenario, Biden is elected, Republicans retain control of the Senate, and we have a very gridlocked government. And because the economy is in really rough shape, this leads to a really strong populist underground movement. And it really puts the US very similar to the position of Weimar Germany in the 1930s. So going into the next election, almost anything can happen. So those are the 4 different scenarios. Again, really focused around the critical uncertainties of what is the shape of the economic recovery and what the results of this coming election look like, and looking at what the world could look like 4 or 5 years from now as we head into the next round of elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. Right, let's get you all into the gallery. Cool. So I'm going to put a polling question up now. That this sort of relates to the first two presentations from. No, we don't want to stop sharing results, and let's get. So this one relates more to the topics that Morgan and Joe were talking to, and again, it's multiple choice, so you can choose which of these scenarios do you feel is most likely, and you can choose more than one. And these kind of relate to this. So while people are voting, we'll leave that up for a while. I want to talk first to some of the issues that came out of your piece, Joe, and yours, Morgan, around how do we get better prepared, not just to deal with what we've got now, but to make sure that this doesn't happen to us. How do we build more of a robust infrastructure? And I know you're focusing on the US, but a lot of the lessons are applicable more globally, and I'm bringing you on this as well, Lee. What are some of the things that you think are essential to really make sure we learn the lessons from this time and put ourselves on a stronger footing for the future? We'll start with you, Joe.
Well, I think Morgan really hit the nail on the head when he talked about the natural reaction after any major crisis to try and make sure that crisis doesn't happen again. And I thought also really loved your scenario, Morgan, because what you're presented is this great example of how we set efficiency aside and start thinking about how do you build a much more robust, resilient system. And I think that's the key, really, is how you have to build resilience into these systems. And the current, at least US model of ultimate efficiency doesn't do that. And so I think that's a big learning we hopefully will take out of this pandemic.
Morgan.
100% concur. There's always the tension between hyper efficient systems and sloppy systems, is the super technical term of phrase. And if you go for efficiency, that also means you're very fragile. If you go for as much leeway as possible in how the system works, it's not nearly as efficient, but it does have room for a bit of sand in the gears. And so if we can just pull back from the hyper focus on profitability and efficiency over all else, and put emphasis on building in that robustness, that resiliency, as to exactly what that looks like, so much depends on the political outcome of November, at least in the US and in the progressive political climates around the world. Because a lot of it is a globalized situation. If you've got a disaster in waiting in China, then you have to build in even more robustness elsewhere so that you can deal with the collapse of that part of the supply chain. There are echoes throughout the global system, so exact solutions have to be devised on the ground rather than in our heads.
What about you, Lee? What's your take?
I think this shows how incredibly poor the US is at foresight, because we've had plenty of warning about this with Ebola and SARS. And the previous administration saw this coming. A lot of that stuff had been dismantled since. I think the US needs to get a lot better at foresight and a lot better at taking that into something that resembles a strategic plan for the presidency and for governance. And that's one of the places where our democracy does not serve us well, because we have completely different administrations every 4 years. It makes it really hard to plan in a straight line in the way that governments like Singapore or even Australia can do. They have much better foresight functions.
So just before I share the results of the poll, just building on this piece that you've all sort of touched on, which is resiliency requires redundancy, that you need some slack in the system to be able to cope. I've seen it in Taiwan. You know, they had redundancy in the system, so they basically had their mechanism up and running by the end of December. Once they got the first warning from a whistleblower in China, they just kicked into gear. But around the world, or even in the US, do you see any examples where there are mechanisms in place, state-run systems, where there is redundancy in the system that can respond. The only one I'm sort of aware of in the US is the National Guard, that in a sense you've got the capacity to go in and you know, marshal forces, bring in additional law and order resources at speed, because that's what they're there for. But I don't know of many other examples. I mean, so I'd be asking you, do you know of any examples where you have that redundancy in the system, just in case?
Well, I think one thing that we're seeing in this pandemic is an sort of controlled growth of local volunteerism.
Right.
And if we see more decisions made at the local and community level, it's easier to harness that, which in some ways I think relates right back to your National Guard model. That's really where the National Guard came out of originally. So I think there's some examples from the current pandemic. There is no structure at all. We just don't build it in anymore at any level of government.
States and national level both try, but they're chronically underfunded because politicians get rewarded for dealing with stuff now, not 10 or 20 years from now. It's
Right.
just a matter of the incentive structure and lack of foresight.
Lee?
And we have unintended and very difficult to measure resilience within the private sector that can shift gears so quickly within the US.
That's true, yeah.
Again, there has to be profit for that to happen, but we've seen incredible shifting in the private sector in terms of just producing materials that are needed very quickly.
Yeah, that's been very true. Let's share the results of the polling. So, which of these scenarios do you feel is most likely? And the largest single group go for calling the pandemic too early, followed by not investing enough time in pandemic preparedness.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, any surprises in those outcomes?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Mine was very much a hopeful scenario in that, like, we actually get our act together, policymakers can agree on a single plan and execute it faithfully and thoughtfully, which is not necessarily a realistic expectation. As a cynical millennial, I fully expect this to devolve into a whole bunch of finger pointing and not much to get done. The can gets kicked down the road, and we hope that it takes another 40 years for the next great pandemic to strike.
And I think these poll results would point toward a W-shaped recovery, you know, very jagged start and stop recovery. And because the policies for the recovery are really called at the local and state level, we're seeing a really wide variety of responses, with the South and Midwest opening up really early, even while their COVID numbers are going up, while the East Coast and West Coast are being much more conservative in opening up.
Mm.
You know, I would add that Lee's W scenario might introduce the possibility for us to learn. And so then the second or third time we shut down, maybe then we'll start to open up with a little more focus on how do we have longer planning. You know, I'm actually hopeful that that happens. I live in Florida. I can't imagine that we won't have that W scenario over the next few months. And I'm just hopeful that we're a little more intelligent the second, third, fourth, and fifth times around.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating, isn't it? As you look across the world, you know, who acted early, who acted decisively, and have already pretty much declared the end of the pandemic, and therefore are back to a kind of more normal recovery cycle. And I'm thinking, you know, New Zealand, to a lesser extent Australia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, kind of moving that way. And whereas other parts of the world, I feel like we'll be stuck in, you know, I don't know what you call it when you have 3 or 4 of these, you know, try to get out, fall back, try to get out, fall back, try to get out, fall back. Because I don't think any of us have seen that or experienced that before, or have any real understanding at the governance level as to how to navigate through it. What are the policy instruments that take you through that sort of jagged edge movement? Right, so let's stop sharing that one, and then I'm going to put a second polling question up. And while we're doing that, we've also got a few questions coming in from the participants. So this one is a question around Lee's 4 scenarios. You can only choose one of these. And which of these do you think is the most likely scenario for the US? And while we're doing that, whilst people are voting out,
I would like to hedge my answer for that until after the poll, Rohit, because I don't want to influence any of our poll takers. Can I
no,
cheat?
that's fine. That's fine. I think you might have
Great.
given it away. All right, so we've got a question here, but we'll put this to everyone. But how do from anonymous attendee, how do the current events taking place in the US, and I assume they're talking about the riots, affect your scenarios? So any of you can talk about this. How does what's going on right now impact the scenarios? Let's start with you, Lee, and then the others can chime in.
Well, first, I'm really sad by what's happening right now because racism has been a problem in the US for far too long, and we should be far further ahead than we are. I think it can further polarize us. I think it increase African American participation in the election, assuming that the Democrats can come up with a more relevant message than "we're not Trump," which they need to do anyway. But I think going into the election, if this continues going into the election, it also raises the possibility that the current administration could call martial law or try to bring in some rule-bending governing policies that impact the election or even delay it.
Yeah, someone else has asked, are these a significant enough threat to impact the safety of the elections? And would that require voting by mail?
We've been voting by mail in California for a long time with very few problems. There's a lot of resistance of that at the national level, of course, because of what Republicans believe voting by mail results could be. So that sort of just falls into the pattern of voter suppression that party has used to try to gain votes by taking away votes from the other side.
Okay. Joe, Morgan, how do you think what's going on at the moment, this horrendous situation, how does that start to impact the election?
Well, this is one of the reasons. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Morgan.
How it impacts the election is a lot left up to the folks who don't have their minds made up. If they see Trump as being not a force for law and order, then they may go with the non-incumbent option, like they did the last few times we had a serious race and police-based riot situation.
Sorry, I meant how does it affect the scenarios, but the elections as well. Yeah.
The scenario, mine gets progressively less and less likely the more conflict there is between the two sides and the less total victory is by one side or the other in the US. Obviously, the Republicans are not very far forward looking at the moment. So I sincerely doubt that they would be willing to implement a 1 month out of every 2 years pause on business. But if the Democrats manage to take control of all three, then all three branches of elective government, then that increases the possibility of a positive, forethoughtful, and pro-resiliency outcome. Whether it'll be mine or not even going to go there. But at least based on current U.S. trends, the party of foresight is decidedly the Democrats at the moment. So.
Okay, Joe.
Well, I was going to say, this is why, as futurists, we avoid talking about the near-term future, right? Because things like this suddenly happen and we're going, where did that come from? In terms of my particular scenario, it is a frightening situation because the more we don't pay attention to overwhelming healthcare and other fragile systems, then the more likely they're going to break. Not to mention massive civil unrest begins to burden those systems even more. So it's very frightening from that point of view. The bright spot, if there is one, and it's hard to say bright spot in this particular instance because Lee's right, this is just unacceptable that we're still doing this in this country. But the potential bright spot is it might push enough people to all decide that Lee's renewal scenario is the one that we really want. And maybe we will see real change. I mean, you know, we have a history in this country of, after major civil unrest, trying to make changes. You know, and hopefully that'll happen again, and we'll see something positive across the board.
Okay.
We're already seeing a Republican congressman trying to put forward a measure against qualified immunity. So I have hopes.
Cool. So we got another question. Let's take this question from Steve Wells. In the US, how much of the federal response to this and other national emergencies is driven by tension and responsibilities at state level and federal level? And what might make the future situation better? So how might we overcome some of those tensions? Who wants to take that? How do we make the situation better? You're all futurists. You've got the answers in your toolbox.
Well, I'll repeat what I said earlier. The bright spot in all of this for me is seeing how some communities have really started to come together and think more innovatively. And the sad truth is I think the U.S. federal government has been long-term damaged, long-term weakened, but that creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum, if we see more local governments actually beginning to try to be a little more professional, try to understand that they have more responsibility, then I think there's a chance that we can dampen down some of the politics, because it's harder to hate your neighbor. It's a lot easier to hate those people who are 2 or 3 states over that you've never really met. And I think that might help long term.
Okay. Lee, Morgan?
I think the lesson for me is the resilience in just the US system of governance, that we've had many governors acting presidential and mayors acting presidential and with foresight, while there's been a complete absence of leadership and coordination at the national level. It's made me sad seeing institutions like the CDC effectively sidelined. And I think as Americans, we're beginning to understand the importance of those institutions and how they really serve us, and that having them be, you know, at least nominally functional is to everyone's benefit.
I think the big takeaway from this whole disaster is that the federal government, it's one of the big points of reckoning that we're going to have as a country is the decision of whether or not state governments and city governments should be left out to dry after a disaster that they have had to spend and spend and spend far beyond their means in order to support their constituents, and whether or not the federal government has a responsibility to support them in turn, because it's not just the profligate states with the horrible budgets who are going to be hemorrhaging money to pay for this. It's all of the ones who have had emergency funds. Those funds are going to be emptied. And the real question is whether or not we're all in this together and the federal government is there for everyone who needs it, or whether it's every state for themselves, every city for themselves. Because if that's the option, if that's the future we choose, we are going to be in for a lot of trouble down the road.
And that's the problem with the W-shaped economic recovery, is that over time, you don't have the resources you had for the first stages of the recovery. You're looking at depleted coffers the further in time you go, which makes government action and spending a lot harder as you keep going on those W's over time.
Right. Well, on that point, let's see what people chose as the scenarios. And we have a clear winner. You sold doubly well to us.
Perhaps too well. I may
Joy.
have jaded my poll takers. I think the W-shaped one is the most likely. That's the one that I'm leaning towards right now. I hope for renewal, and I fear the American Reich.
Yeah. Anyone else got any comments on the results of that vote? Any surprises there?
Sadly, no.
It's interesting that not. Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say I would agree with those results. Although I think the Greatest Depression has a higher probability than we might want to give it. 15% might be low.
Yeah, I think there's an element there of not wanting it rather than not believing it's possible. I think there's a certain bias that comes into our voting on these things. Understandably so. Understandably. So we got some great questions coming in. So we've got a question here from Chad Gorski. In a world of faster news cycles and diminishing attention spans, how do we promote more slow and deliberate thinking at the corporate, civic, and political levels? Who wants to go first on that? Morgan, how do we?
I think that we're already seeing that, at least at the just in terms of people's long-term horizons. Communities are starting to think in terms of, like, can we sustain the expansion of our suburban areas? Can we? Do we have the resources needed to support our community down the road rather than like right now? Corporations likewise are thinking about PR value. Like the instant news feed is something that they actually have to take into account and have to start building. Okay, what kind of responsibility do we need to take in order to not have it bite us in the butt 10 years from now when public opinion changes? Like this thing that we can skate by on right now, do we really want to be skating by on it if people are going to look at our record in 10 years and go, that's not cool? Obviously, the huge shock to supply lines and to budgets is going to have a narrowing of focus in the near term. But I think that provided that people don't stick their heads in the sand after this is all over and pretend that it can't possibly happen again, I think that we are going to see just a psychological response to this, where people start looking ahead and start thinking about, okay, do we have enough? Are we taking the actions that we need to be taking to survive something like this? That's a hope, at least. Whether or not it actually comes true, we'll see.
Joe, how do we slow things down, particularly the thinking?
Yeah, not an easy one. One of the things that I have seen a little evidence of is that the younger adult generation, the 20s and 30-year-olds in this country, have been through so many disruptions and are beginning to understand that they have to rely on themselves to be able to deal with, is it a month delay? Is it suddenly I'm, potentially furloughed from a job because I worked in a theme park somewhere? And we're beginning, I think, to at least see the conversation that says we have to start saving more. We have to quit chasing some of the dreams that we were chasing if we're going to have a long-term future. Whether or not that'll spread, I think, is the real question right now. Those of us in the boomer generation have not done our part to really help people understand that long-term thinking is what we need to be doing.
I think that the instant response from the millennial and Generation Z would be, if we've got the resources to start thinking ahead rather to start saving, because a lot of us don't. And like, it's really hard to think a year ahead when you don't have money to meet rent in the next week.
Lee.
I think it comes down to two things: leadership and education. That as leaders, we need to be encouraging other leaders to take a more foresightful view of the future and to start including the future in the decisions that we're making now. I think we have institutional biases against the future, both in our system of governments in the US and our system of reporting results quarterly in the private sector, that really erode futures thinking. And it takes leaders who are really committed to doing that and who are in it for the long haul to do that. Then the second aspect is in education. I know that Peter Bishop is leading an initiative called Teach the Future, which aims to make foresight part of the educational curriculum in educational institutions. And I think that this is a generation that's going to need futures thinking more than any previous generation, because they're going to face much larger and more consequential and more interconnected problems than we have faced.
Thank you. Well, let's take another question here. This is from Rudy Breeder. Can you provide some context or discuss how the presenters think about how the trade disputes and polarization of Trump is causing two worlds, one with China and one with the US. And then he adds a rider that the US seems to be abandoning international organizations like the World Health Organization, the UN, and its allies like Germany, Australia, Canada. So he's already answered the question, which is America's become alone. But what's your view on kind of how does this current set of trade tensions play out? What are the possibilities as futurists looking at this? What are some of the scenarios you see for the big global trade picture? Or is this trade argument just a subterfuge for some other deeper conflict that we're masking with trade? You know, is it dominance of AI or whatever that some of the theories go? Who wants to have a go at that? What are the scenarios for how trade tensions could play out?
I'll take a shot at it. I think first, I'm horrified by the U.S. withdrawal from global institutions, especially at a time when I believe the U.S. is needed. I think it's creating a conundrum for the rest of the world because the U.S. is conspicuously absent or even throwing sand in the gears of global institutions, which leaves a huge opening for China, but most of the world doesn't trust China either. So I think that ends up creating a world of much more regional trading blocks that are trying to become more interdependent. I think the trade war is masking really a great power super conflict between the US and China, where the US is trying to continue global dominance while it's eroding from the inside, and China is the ascendant global power that everyone fears and no one trusts.
Okay.
I think in some ways it's a natural historical movement. One superpower tends to reach a peak, stay there for a while, and then begin to lose its dominance. And that's certainly what's happening. And the current administration is doing everything they can to rush that, but I don't think that they're certainly not completely at fault. There are lots of things that are playing into that. There is a chance that we will see coming out of this a more collaborative organization of powers, at least in the sort of US and Europe bloc, maybe. I think that would be good. The unknown factor is, is China going to pursue the sort of traditional superpower, we want to dominate the world? And right now they certainly are following that path. So that's where I think the real interesting challenge is how do we bring China, acknowledge that they're going to be very powerful, but also then bring them into a new world order that's about collaboration and not just competition.
Yes.
Morgan.
I think that part of the problem with if both China and the US were rational actors, either of them were rational actors, we wouldn't be dealing with this. The fact is that the US is currently wrestling with a nationalist movement. And China has been in the throes of a nationalist movement for at least the past decade. I'm not enough of a Chinese historian to tell you much longer than that, but they're using nationalism as a way to cement the communist regime. And there's a limit to how far back they can pull the throttle on expansion and throwing their weight around without losing face to their own public. So it's not so much a question of getting China to adapt to the international system as adapting the international system in a way that gives China a reason to not push any further. What that exact solution is, I don't know. As for the whole trade question, I think that a lot would change based on a different administration. Whether that's Republican or Democrat, I think that a different administration would have a hugely different take on foreign power and foreign involvement, just because there's so much of the neocon and the old guard Republican take on foreign policy still extant in Washington. Has just been thrown to the side for the moment. They're still there. They still believe what they used to believe. It's just they're not the people talking anymore. And Democrats obviously would not be going in the direction we're currently going. As for the globalization question, though, that's an entirely different kettle of fish, and that's a lot of that depends on how America and Europe and other G20 nations can change the distribution of income from globalization. Whether I'm not saying like destroy capitalism or anything like that extreme, but just the sheer degree to which people aren't sharing in the largesse of the globalized economy is what has led to a lot of the unrest that has caused the current moment. So there's a degree of making sure that the West and the rich nations own houses are cleaned, and also ensuring that China has a place that is both secure and not something that they feel the need to push out from within the new world order.
On this issue of trust, we have another question from Steve Wells, who says, has the recent past shown us that we can trust China and the US, but we just don't like what we can trust that they will do?
Real politics is never pleasant.
I would add to that, what would it take for us to stop using the language of we can't trust China? What would they need to do to gain a level of trust in the world, or is that just not even on the table right now? Is there no place in the story for the chapter that says, and we trust China because?
So I think if I can continue my rant from earlier, I think that the conundrum of that kind of tit for tat kind of, do we trust them? No, because they did X in the past. Do they trust us? No, because we did X, Y in the past. Is to offer the immortalized reset and see what happens. That's the only way to get the kind of tit for tat to stop, is to just not throw the tat when someone gives you a provocation, and to say, okay, that's it. If you do it again, we go right back at it, and there's no hope. Whether or not that will ever happen, I don't know. But the real trigger point for saying we can trust China is for China to not receive any provocations from the West, as difficult as that might be, considering that simply existing can sometimes be a provocation, and for China not to offer any provocations in return for a period, whether that's a year or 5 years, I don't know. Do either of you want to add anything to that?
I would just say there's really good reasons not to trust China. That they've been very aggressive in the military extension of the South China Sea. The way that AI is being used to create a surveillance society of their own citizenry is very concerning. The financial deals that they have done around other countries, particularly African countries, have been concerning. But I would point out there's really no reason to trust the US either. If you look at our track record, I think the US is arguably less trustworthy than China. So I think that makes countries around the world not want to depend on either superpower and look for more things like regional cooperation, much like what you're seeing in Europe.
Joe, anything to add on that? You guys are popular. The questions just keep coming in.
Historically, there's not a lot of support that we will suddenly start trusting each other. And historically, if we have a continued economic slowdown and crises, then we're heading toward war and things like that. But being a futurist and putting on my optimist hat and expanding my imagination, there might be a future where the problems that we face globally are so large that the only way to pay for them is to eliminate these huge military budgets, as opposed to going to war to distract people from them. And if we were to do that, maybe we could begin to do what Morgan's talking about, and that is just change the playing field. I wouldn't put that high on the list of potential scenarios for the future, but it's certainly one that would be worth exploring and thinking about other ways we could nudge toward that future.
Okay, we're going to take one last question. Apologies to the others who framed them, but this is from Paul Plant, so we're going to take 30 seconds each. He's a fellow contributor to the book. to what degree has COVID alone or COVID plus Minneapolis begun to change opinions on Trump's leadership shortcomings? 36 seconds each. Have these events had any impact on people's opinions of Trump and his leadership?
Depends on who you ask, obviously. Most people on both sides of the equation are pretty locked in. I will say that there's some evidence that the older white boomers who had elected him had started to be less firmly in his camp with the COVID-19 because they're the ones who are going to see the most impact from the disease.
Morgan.
Concur with that. Also point out that those elderly white boomers are likely the ones who are going to be most concerned about the current riots and more likely to flip back to Republican. That said, I think that the picture of the White House shut down in front of a whole bunch of rioters is a pretty defining picture for this point in time.
Lee, you get the last.
I think we have a very polarized world, and it's just entrenched people in whatever their polarization is. It's been amazing to me that Trump's support has remained between 35 and 40% pretty much no matter what he does. So I don't see that changing a lot. I think the biggest change I could see this is really galvanizing the African-American vote going into the next election.
Okay, well, thank you guys. Joe,
Thank you.
Morgan, Lee.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant presentations, and thank you for just being so willing to cover the territory you've covered in the Q&A. It's been excellent and fascinating. And thank you to everyone who's asked all those questions. It's been really, really fun. So thank you all, and yeah,
for tuning in.
Go away and enjoy the
Thank you.
The session if you're saying
Enjoy the rest of the marathon, Rohit.
Yeah, thank you. All right, cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.
To the participants, we're going to take a 20-minute break now. We'll be starting again at 7:20 UK time with the next three contributors, similar sort of format. So see you shortly. Thank you.